You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for September 25th, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy, also known as Royal Cassidy.
And indeed, absolutely. Thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation. Our 2001 retrospective has begun.
It has.
Very exciting. Yeah. This is one of the funnest things we get to do each and every year. If you're new to the show, we've been doing usually one of these retrospectives a year.
Right.
And around this time, and we are counting backwards. So, we started, because In Session Film started in 2013,
right.
We've been counting backwards since then.
Yeah.
So we're moving forward in real time, obviously, but we're also moving backwards each year as well.
No coincidence that the year 2001 saw the release of one Christopher Nolan's Memento, which you basically just described in movement.
Exactly.
Right.
Indeed.
Yeah.
However,
man, maybe we should have reviewed that one instead.
We could have. We did talk about it.
Yeah.
But that's how this has been going, and we've arrived at the year 2001, which has many, many great movies that we'll get to on the main show when we get to that retrospective. However, we kick off the retrospective by reviewing a film that is defining to that particular year.
Right.
And Wes Anderson's The Royal Tenenbaums is one of those. There are certainly 3 or 4 others that we considered for this conversation.
More like 7 or 8, probably.
Yeah. And honestly, most of them we've talked about before in some capacity. Mulholland's Drive was a review on Extra Film.
Yep.
Lord of the Rings, we did a series of that last year. You and I did a review of In the Mood for Love. That was also covered on Extra Film, so that's been tackled twice already.
That's a up review. That just goes to show that movie's pretty good, I guess.
Absolutely. Soderbergh's Ocean's 11 has been covered.
Yeah.
Amelie has been covered. Devil's Backbone and Moulin Rouge were technically covered back in 2013. But those certainly could have been in the conversation. I don't know if they define the year as much as those aforementioned films, however.
Yeah.
So it came down to, hey, look, one of these movies we're going to have to double dip. And of the options that we consider to be defining of 2001, there was one movie that stood above the rest because Wes Anderson's The Royal Tenenbaums, while it is a film that we have technically covered, we have done many movie series over the years here at In Session Film. And the very first one we did was Wes Anderson.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
so it's a little,
little
serendipitous. It was early. It was before my time. I mean, that's more or less the point I think you're trying to get at, because the film has been reviewed for my time. So while you and I have at least openly discussed this movie and Wes Anderson in general on many episodes before, whether they were planned or not, you and I have never given an in-depth review or discussion on the Royal Tenenbaums, at least in an official setting.
Exactly. It's come up in various top 3s over the years, but you and I have never done a review of it, whereas all of these other defining films of 2001 we have covered in some way. So it's been 10 years since we've given this review. Obviously, a lot has changed since early 2013.
I gotta be honest. I haven't listened to that review that was done way back in 2013. So that was with you and Nate Parsons, I assume. Right?
Yes, I believe so. And if memory serves, I might be misremembering here, but if memory serves, I want to say our guest for the episode was DJ Valentine.
Oh my!
And
gosh.
As much as I love
DJ Valentine,
as much as I love DJ, I don't know if Anderson or the Royal Tenenbaums is his thing. I'd have to go back and listen to it, though. I can't say definitively. Maybe he did love that film. I really don't know.
I feel like I have to fact check you on this because back in the day on the website, we actually had letter grades for these. So there could be something, published on the site to confirm what you're talking about. I have to quickly do some research here.
Yeah, perhaps we can look that up as we begin here. But yeah, it's been a while. And Brennan obviously wasn't there for that conversation. So it just made the most sense. So we're here to talk about Wes Anderson's The Royal Tenenbaums. We'll give that a review here, and then on episode 554. Is that what we're on now? 555?
It might be. Is it? It's not 553, is it? We don't even know how to keep track of our own numbers anymore.
I can't even keep track. I've just lost the track of the numbers.
I'm too busy counting down days to my wedding. I can't keep track of episode numbers. That's secondary.
I hear
now.
No, I completely hear you on that. So either way, the latest episode that will drop immediately after this one, that will be our 2001 retrospective, where we'll talk about our top 10 movies of 2001.
It will be 553. You were right.
Okay. So 553. Very much looking forward to that. Now, before we get to the review, Brendan, and maybe this is part of your opening thoughts. I don't know if I'm stealing any thunder here.
You probably are, but I think it's good setup.
I wanted to ask you your previous thoughts on this movie before you did any sort of preparation for this episode. I'm not sure if you've rewatched the film for this or not. What was your relationship to this film previously, and how does it fall within your adoration of Anderson as a whole?
Yeah, well, we've talked about this before, right, JD, that Wes Anderson was sort of one of those filmmakers I had to learn to appreciate as I got older. When we started, or at least when I joined In Session Film, 2014, I think that was, I openly admitted I was kind of mixed on Wes Anderson, right? And The Royal Tenenbaums is one of those movies I always admired, but never fully connected with emotionally. I think the film that really started to get on board with Wes Anderson and made me retroactively go back and sort of reevaluate his work, it was either Fantastic Mr. Fox or The Grand Budapest Hotel. Those two films made me think, okay, I'm starting to see what other people see. And going back and reevaluating a lot of his films, at least from my current lens at that time, The Royal Tenenbaums was one that always got better as time went on for me. And up until this specific review we're about to do now, it was in my top 3 Wes Anderson films.
Okay.
And I guess, I mean, we've openly admitted that we're fans of this movie now, right? I feel like we don't have to build up to any like reveal that, guess what, everyone, we love this movie. It is still in my top. It is still in my top 3 Wes Anderson films. And in fact, it's grown even more on a rewatch in preparation for this retrospective. It's interesting because if you were to ask me what my favorite Wes Anderson film is, I'd probably still say Fantastic Mr. Fox, because it is just so rewatchable for me. It just has that that level of absurdist charm that I just can't get enough of, and that's certainly present in The Royal Tenenbaums. But there's a tenderness to this movie that I don't think Wes Anderson's really been able to replicate all that much, honestly, ever. But I mean, he has had those qualities in a lot of his later films, especially most recently with Asteroid City. I think there's definitely some tonal comparisons you can make, but never at this same level as The Royal Tenenbaums. There's a relatability to this movie that I don't think he's ever been able to, or at least he hasn't really tried to replicate again, because it just feels like it's about everyone in so many ways, even despite the quirky qualities that it has. And in many ways, it's sort of like the first true definition of what a Wes Anderson movie could be. The way it sort of straddles the line between some of his more, I guess, practical approaches with movies like Rushmore and Bottle Rocket that had more of an indie kind of flair to it. They felt more lived in. They weren't quite the dollhousey aesthetics that we tend to associate him with. This was where I feel like that vibe started to get slowly introduced. So in some ways, this film is like the perfect middle ground between the Wes Anderson of the past and what he would become. And it's in many ways, it almost makes it seem like the perfect Wes Anderson buffet all rolled into one movie. Which is basically my long-winded way of saying, if you were to ask me my favorite Wes Anderson movie, it's probably still Fantastic Mr. Fox, but I do think Royal Tenenbaums is his best. I think it is, in many ways, the definitive definition of a Wes Anderson film.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I'll be as intricate with my response to that question as much as Brendan. I will simply say as this, and if you follow us on social media, this will come to no surprise. I literally just tweeted this out. It is my favorite Wes Anderson. It's one of my favorite films of all time. I love this movie. I think you articulated beautifully why it's so great. We'll certainly get much, much more into it as we jump into the review. But I've always loved this film. From the immediate first watch of it, I fell under its spell. And you're right that, you know, it's interesting when you look at this in the context of Anderson's filmography. While this film does have that dollhouse aesthetic, or at least the beginning stages of who Wes will become in that regard, the Royal Tenenbaums, for me, in the context of Wes Anderson, because again, the film on its own, we'll get into this. I think about those early Wes Anderson films, not just aesthetically in how we see him grooming himself as a filmmaker. It's the writing with Owen Wilson that I find so provocative and fascinating. And that has become this time capsule in many ways, because the two have not collaborated since the Royal Tenenbaums, or at least those early Wes Anderson films. It's been quite a long time. And I've always loved the writing of Wes's films. They're really great. And in particular, these last two, I feel like he's evolved into almost a completely different filmmaker. And I'm not
sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but didn't Owen Wilson work with him on the Darjeeling Limited?
That's why I couldn't remember if it was quite this one or Darjeeling.
Still, I mean, they were in pretty close proximity with it. They were still part of that same decade. So at the very least, it's been what, like at least 15 years.
It's been a while. Either way, it's been a while. And so while they've gone their separate ways, and again, I've still loved the writing of Wes, it does make his early works so distinctive to me because of not just the beginning stages of Wes as a filmmaker and how unique that is all on its own terms, but the writing with Owen Wilson, I just find distinctly its own thing as well. And I do think that is defining of the Royal Tenenbaums in many respects. So yeah, I've always loved this. I did rewatch this last night in preparation for this conversation, so I will have plenty to say on it as we go. Before we do, though, I did look it up. Episode 58, back in March of 2013. We talked about this movie.
And sorry, as we're in the, I guess, the phase of looking things up to fact check ourselves mid-conversation here, I think you were right. I think it was the Royal Tenenbaums being the last time that Wes Anderson and Owen Wilson worked together in writing form. Because the Darjeeling Limited, yes, he was in that movie, but so was Jason Schwartzman. But Jason Schwartzman was the co-writer on that movie.
There you go.
So it was another one. So I was conflating the two actors from that one.
Yeah, which, you know, that's another Anderson contributor, obviously, a big one for Wes in those early days. So that's very easy to do. I don't blame you there. But yeah, glad we were able to confirm that. But yes, DJ Valentine and Matthew from Simplistic Reviews, they both joined for that episode. The lead up to it was the Aronofsky film Noah. That's primarily
that makes perfect sense to pair together
for that show. But we also just happened to be in the middle of that Anderson movie series, and the Royal Tenenbaums was the film for that episode. But yes, you're right, Brendan. At that time, we did give grades, and DJ and Matthew both gave it an A. So they did love it.
Good for them. They're men of taste. They really are men of taste, aren't they?
Love that. Yeah. I'm glad I was able to go back and look that up. All right, let's get into the Royal Tenenbaums. It is, of course, directed by Wes Anderson, written by Wes Anderson and Owen Wilson. As we noted, it stars Gene Hackman, Gwyneth Paltrow, Ben Stiller, Luke Wilson, Owen Wilson, Angelica Houston, Danny Glover, Bill Murray, among others. If you're not familiar with this, I imagine you're not listening, but just in case, it is about the eccentric members of a dysfunctional family who reluctantly gather under the same roof for various reasons. All right. We've already laid out the groundwork here, but Brendan,
I know. It's like, yeah, so the intro is done. We people know what we think about it. Where do we want to go from here now?
All these years later, what do you think about the Royal Tenenbaums?
Oh, it's still great. So I you know what's fun about these retrospectives, JD, is when you and I sort of secretly try and predict each other's lists, our top 10 lists for the year. And we're always going to have crossover, right? Some years more than others. I forget what year it was. I think it was 2004. We almost had the exact same top 10 list, just in a different order. I think we had like 8 crossovers or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how many crossovers we'll have for 2001. I think it'll be fun to speculate on that right before giving our lists on that episode, 553 coming up. But I will say there's no way one of us is not going to have the Royal Tenenbaums on their list. We're both going to have it. In fact, it's probably it's probably going to be in both our top 5s. I'm just going to say that right now. I think we picked the right movie to showcase as a defined movie from the year 2001, and I think it's because it's all a defined movie for its director, like we were talking about. I'll say it again. It's this beautiful middle ground between Wes Anderson kind of growing up, which is a very good reflection of the main characters, the children here, the Tenenbaums specifically, and what he would be doing as a filmmaker later on, because many filmmakers sort of have that one film where you could sort of see the midpoint in their career of sorts, right? Yeah. Like let's say with someone like a David Fincher, that film could probably be Zodiac, right? You kind of see that transition happening in one movie, and I feel like the Royal Tenenbaums is that movie for Wes Anderson. We've already said a lot in those opening thoughts, right, about what we think about this movie. We even started to articulate on some of the themes that we'll certainly talk more about, I'm sure, whether it be around the dysfunctionality of this family, the redemption arc of Royal Tenenbaum himself. There's more to it than there's. Like I said, this is a very related movie for Wes Anderson, because a lot of the problems that the Tenenbaum family goes through, despite the absurdist narrative around it, it's very relatable. It's stuff that many of us can relate to. I love the way that Wes Anderson is tapping into certain influences to tell this story. It feels very like J.D. Salinger in some ways. I was kind of thinking like of Catcher in the Rye and works like that. Apparently, that was a noted inspiration for Wes Anderson. I don't have the pull quote or anything, but I think I remember hearing that was something he was influenced by when making this movie, and especially writing it with Owen Wilson. And of course, just given the title, The Royal Tenenbaums, it's eerily similar to the Orson Welles film, The Magnificent Embersons, right?
A film I also love.
Exactly. Yeah, you're a big Orson Welles stan, so there's definitely some comparisons you can draw there, but. It's interesting to see such a tenderness in a movie that still carries the usual absurdist humor that Wes Anderson is known for, and yet it all just feels like it's of a piece, and a lot of it is also due to these great performances, which I'm sure we'll talk about. We mentioned this already on episode 552 when we talked about our favorite performances of the year. I do think Gene Hackman's performance in this movie is the best performance of the entire year, of 2001 specifically. Maybe the best performance of his career. I don't know. Career. I love him in The Conversation. I do love him. The
Conversation is also all time.
And let's not forget Unforgiven. Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, which is a performance that could have easily fallen into the trappings of just like villain of the week, type of vibe for that. And he sort of plays it that way, but has some hidden nuances that make that way more complex than it really has any right to be. Oh man, French Connection. Gene Hackman, one of the greatest actors of all time. That's really the moral of this entire conversation. But so I guess I'm trying to be careful when I say this might be the best performance of his career, but
it's in The Conversation.
It
No
is.
pun intended.
It's in the conversation. Nice work there. But yeah, I was just gonna say I don't think I would push back too much on anyone that is willing to make that argument. I do think he is amazing here in a very understated performance. It's kind of a performance that sneaks up on you. You don't realize how great it is until you ponder on the relatability of the story. I do think it is quite great. So yeah, top 3 Wes Anderson, probably top 5 movies of the year for 2001 specifically. I think this is a wonderful movie. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, this film, especially after a rewatch, absolutely confirms without question that it is Wes Anderson's best film. And of course, it's one of the best movies of 2001. Spoiler alert, it will absolutely crack my top 5 when we get to that list here on the main show.
I think I know what your top 3 is. I'm just going to say it right now.
You probably do. No doubt about it. I think listeners, longtime listeners especially, will be able to.
Well, to be fair, you probably know mine as well. I can't play that like a snarky puppy.
Not only do I think you'll be able to get my top 4, the 5th one could be arguable. I think not only do you know my top 4, I bet you could get it in order. So that'll be a fun exercise when we get to that list.
We'll do that on episode 553.
Yeah, absolutely. But that is to say, yes, this is bar none one of the best films of 2001. And as you're talking about, there is a deep sorrow that palpably lingers over every frame in this film. It's unlike anything in Wes's filmography. In fact, I was hard-pressed to find out that Spielberg didn't co-write this because it's one of the most arresting films ever made about divorce and how it's affected each person of the Tenenbaum family differently, especially when the turmoil of divorce is never dealt with. The dysfunction that comes as a result is darkly funny, and it's imbued with Anderson's quirky spirit, but it's also rooted in a fervent honesty and sadness. The lingering desire for connection that these characters evoke is so incredibly poignant, and Anderson fosters that emotion with great diligence. So when those strong emotional beats do rise to the surface, the catharsis is tantalizing. I've Had a Rough Year, Dad is one of the best scenes of that year, that decade even. Hell, it may be one of the best moments ever between a father and a son. Or I think about the image of Margot and Richie tenderly cuddling in the tent near the end of the film, given the emotional trajectory of those characters. We'll certainly get into more examples as this conversation goes, but this is a film that vividly demonstrates, without ambiguity, the brokenness of these characters, primarily due to their upbringing and Royal's imprudency, and then deconstructs their fragmentation with a gentle warmth and sincerity when Royal, of all people, wanted to spend time with his family again. That dichotomy here is nothing short of sublime. This ensemble cast is breathtaking in how they invoke all of that, especially Gene Hackman. I'm completely with you. One of the best, if not the best performance of that year. He was my winner for Best Actor. I believe you mentioned that as well. Ben Stiller, Luke Wilson, Gwyneth Paltrow, all nominated for me in supporting categories for 2001. But Angelica Houston, Danny Glover, and Owen Wilson are all very good as well and noteworthy. Agreed. We'll talk more about them as this conversation goes as well, I presume. The costuming and makeup work in this film is ravishing. It's very memorable. You just say the name, the Royal Tenenbaums, and that tracksuit or the headband that Luke Wilson wears, or the outfit that Gwyneth Paltrow has. Like it instantly
created a vibe. It created its own vibe.
Absolutely. I also think about the music. This is arguably the best soundtrack of any Wes Anderson film. Every musical note is impeccable. I absolutely love how it is interwoven. This film simply is an all-timer. These characters are so complicated. They're all suffering in their own way. And all Anderson wants to do is have an honest conversation about the disrupting force of love and togetherness on a battered family who struggled otherwise. And I'm deeply, deeply moved by it all.
You know what I love about this movie too is the way Wes Anderson paints a family tree here. Because whenever you see a movie that's about a family and it has a pretty extensive cast, you kind of want to try and like visualize the hierarchy, if that makes sense. And that is certainly here, but you can also do that with the emotionality that's tying them together. What turmoils are tying them together. So, for instance, you've got the divorce that lingers on this family between Royal and Ethelene, I believe was his ex-wife, played by Angelica Houston. I think I'm pronouncing that right. But what does she do in response? She tries to raise those children as best that she can and really forces, intelligence and success on them, to the point that maybe that's also something that drove them away, like the over dependence on success. And sometimes families do that. Parents can do that. And there's always this lingering dotted line or ripple effect between every action between these characters that you can almost create like a therapeutic family tree of sorts. And Wes Anderson has obviously done the work to see how and why these people react to each other in the ways that they do. Right. And that's what I think is brilliant about the film, is that there's just such an emotional intricacy to it. And one of my favorite examples you already mentioned, and I was going to bring it up, the lovely tent scene between Margot and Richie. And that lovely quote, I think it's uttered here, when she says to him, "I think we just have to be secretly in love with each other." I mean, there has been some, I guess, controversy of a sort around the romantic interests of those two characters, because they are technically brother and sister, even though there is an adoption between one of them. So they're not brother and sister by blood. But I think it's so interesting that they have those feelings for each other, because in a weird and ironic way, it almost emphasizes the further distance between them, right? That this love for them emphasizes that they know what they're doing is wrong, that it only adds to the familial distance and confusion that they have for each other and themselves. So it's just, I love that irony, because usually in a movie like this, if there is any love between two characters, it's meant to emphasize closeness, togetherness. And here, the love they have for each other kind of emphasizes distance. So it's, I found that so fascinating rewatching it again, that it made their quote unquote romantic interest in each other so purposeful. And that's kind of emblematic of the whole movie, is that everything has a purpose. It really does.
Man, do I love Richie in this film.
Yeah.
Luke Wilson is a performer that isn't talked about because of his performances often, but I nominated him for Best Supporting Actor for a reason. I think this is by far the best performance he's given in film. And I love how that tethers to the writing of Richie here, because this is a character that feels utterly disconnected from the world, which, as you're talking about, is partially or mostly rooted in his love for his adopted sister, which is maybe taboo. Although, as you noted, they are not blood related. But I think Anderson does a really great job of navigating those nuanced layers. And Wilson is incredible in how he conveys that conflict in Richie. It's a really tender and doleful performance. The way he shows empathy to his father throughout the film is warm and affable. The way he shows grace and patience with Chaz, knowing that he's had a really hard time. The way he shows friendship and affection to Eli, who not only slept with Margot, knowing that he was in love with her, but also had this drug problem, and he just wanted to get Eli some help. And of course, it's his love for Margot. At every turn, there's this gentle quality to him, despite his melancholy and disconnect to the world. His suicide sequence is so devastating in how it's framed and edited to look into the camera, looking at us while he's shaving and contemplating his sorrow, is just remarkable filmmaking to me. But on the other side of it, I love how he maintains that gentle quality. There's that aforementioned scene of him and Margot in the tent that I think is so beautiful. But another moment that gobsmacked me here was this moment with Royal on a rooftop.
Oh,
where
yeah.
Royal says, "Do you consider me your father?" To which Richie replies with, "Sure I do." Royal then rebuttals with, "I wish I had more to offer in that department," referencing his own fatherhood and how disappointed he is in himself. And Richie's response is so soft and warm, where he just says, "I know you do, Pop," and has nothing but forgiveness for him. It is so good. It is so good. The writing and the dialogue there is great. The music and how that is edited or interwoven, the editing of that scene on its own terms is really great. But what really strikes me is Gene Hackman, who we'll get to Royal here in a moment, and this longing for connection with his family again. That's certainly a big part of what's happening here as well. But from Richie's perspective, and that's who we're talking about right now, to have this warmth, tenderness to him, despite the disconnect he had felt. In fact, it was so strong that he tried to end it. And failed in the process. And now he's re-engaging with the world and doing so with his father in this incredible way, where he's offering forgiveness to Royal, which is all Royal really wanted in the first place. It's
and
so
how
good.
and how ironic, or I guess not even ironic, how appropriate that isn't that the scene when Mordecai returns, the bird?
Yes, I believe. Yeah, that is correct.
So there is. I don't know if symbolism or even metaphor is the right word, but it certainly represents this redemptive quality of those characters in that moment. You jokingly said that it almost seems like Spielberg would have had a hand in writing this story because of its aspects on divorce, but I don't know. You made it as a joke, but it's not really that much of a joke when you think about it, because this
honestly,
scene is kind of,
if you asked Spielberg what he thought of this film, I almost guarantee his response would be, "Yeah, it's a masterpiece." I relate with it wholeheartedly.
Well, because I was going to say, this is probably the closest that Wes Anderson has come to making something that feels kind of Spielbergian. And that's not to say it's, like it's sentimental and the qualities that Spielberg is usually very good at. It has some of that for sure, but it just taps into something thematically that Spielberg has really worn on his sleeve throughout much of his career, whether he even knew it or not. And the way that Wes Anderson depicts it, especially on that rooftop scene, it has an emotional quality that almost feels comparable to something like a Spielberg. And I will, like it's not often that I feel genuinely moved by a Wes Anderson movie. I love a lot of his movies, but for very different reasons. A lot of times I'll latch on to the quirky qualities of them, such as, let's say, Fantastic Mr. Fox, for instance, or even the Darjeeling Limited. I think that's a very fun movie for what it is. But that's not really what he's going for here. And because of what he's depicting there on that rooftop scene, coupled with those performances, it really works. And I agree. Luke Wilson, I don't think I had him as one of my nominees for Best Supporting Actor on episode 552, and I'm kind of kicking myself for that.
It's understandable, because you don't often think of Luke Wilson in that way. Maybe even in this film, because you think of Ben Stiller and that moment at the end and his catharsis. Gwyneth Paltrow, I feel like has been in the conversation a lot with this film, and of course Gene Hackman. And so I do feel like Luke Wilson gets lost in the discourse, but he gives as great a performance as anyone else here. And of course, when we're talking about male supporting performances of that year, he's easily in that top 5 as far as I'm concerned. And so much of it comes down to that gentle warmth that he conveys, despite the disconnect he feels from the world as it relates to his sister, Margot, who, as we noted, there's a taboo element to it. So like all of those complicated nuances create this conflict that feels a little weird, but it's so tender, and you feel that poignancy in his performance so viscerally. And I love how he taps into that here. It is truly, truly breathtaking stuff.
And the more we talk about his performance, I'm starting to think that his performance may have been the most challenging one out of any actor in this movie, because a lot of these other actors are told to convey this sorrow, this sadness. But a lot of it is sort of in the script, and that's not to knock these performances. They do a perfect job conveying it, but there may be a bit more of a literal quality in their arcs when compared to someone like Richie, Luke Wilson. His is a little bit more secretive. It's like that tender quality that he's evoking that you're talking about. In a way, it almost secretly evokes this deep-rooted anger that's never really spoken. So like the fact that his performance has to have multiple layers happening simultaneously, that you feel something kind of buried underneath and you don't have to be told about that, that kind of shows how challenging that performance is. And the more we talk about it, yeah, I'm definitely kicking myself for not nominating Luke Wilson.
It's so good. It's so good. And the one moment of catharsis where that anger might rise to the surface that you're talking about is the moment when Raleigh, the Bill Murray character, who was married to Margot, confronts him about her infidelity.
Right.
And so he's forced to confront it in a way, but again, having to mask it because he can't tell Raleigh the truth either. That's Margot's husband. So like there's a lot of interesting layers here where he has to navigate, hiding the truth of how he feels from the world because of how taboo it might look. But also she's married. Also, she is having sex with his best friend. There's that. And, he's also keeping it from his family. And so he's having to remove himself from everything that he knows. And that creates this turmoil. And that it comes through. I know that we've seen the moment of people contemplating suicide, looking in front of the mirror, shaving. That in and of itself isn't new. But the way Anderson frames it in context of everything we're talking about and Luke Wilson's performance here, given how tender it is, it makes that trope invigorating to me. And utterly mesmerizing from an emotional perspective.
Agreed.
That to me, it works. And then on the other side of that specific sequence, again, he's re-engaging with the world, but still maintaining that tender warmth. And how that comes through, it is incredible to me.
And there's still an element of surprise to it as well. And I think that's another reason why it works so well. And not to say that it's there to shock the audience like a cheap thrill, right? But a lot of times when a scene like that happens in a movie, you can kind of sense that it's coming. There's almost like these warning signs, and that's not to say that they shouldn't that they shouldn't be there. But Wes Anderson treats it like a sudden shock to the system, as if it is Richie's own shock to the system, that this is his own way of dealing with it, is to make this unfortunate action. So it's why I think him breaking the fourth wall, like you already brought up, is probably one of the greatest fourth wall breaking moments in any movie, because it keys us into that.
I agree. And to speak to that surprise even more, and this circles back to not just the performance, but Anderson's filmmaking, because Richie says, tomorrow I'm going to kill myself. Then there's an immediate edit to blood trickling down the sink. And the next thing we know, we see him on the floor. So it's as if he surprises himself in the moment. I'm going to kill myself tomorrow, but instead he slices himself now. In that moment, exactly.
The weird sleight of hand there. And it's I'm not sure what to make of it, but it's devastating. That's the only way I can describe it, which is I don't think I've ever used that word to describe a Wes Anderson movie before.
There is a melancholy to this film that you just don't see in any of his other films. There might be a slight sorrow to them. It's one of the things I loved about Asteroid City, as you noted earlier. I think Asteroid City is Anderson evolving into this new stratosphere, but also going back to his roots of something like the Royal Tenenbaums. But I still don't think it ever reaches the heights of this film in terms of its sadness. As funny as I do think this film is, and we can certainly get to the humor here in a little bit, but every frame of this film, as I noted in my opening thoughts, it echoes that somber quality in every way. And that in and of itself is a shock to the system when you consider Wes Anderson. But I love how he taps into that here. Can we talk about Royal?
Yeah, let's talk about Royal.
I want to talk about Royal.
Yeah.
And again, this is where the S word really goes a long way, that being sincerity. A word that
it's one of our favorite words. It's one of our safe words on this show.
Yeah, it is. Because yes, his actions and lies are selfish, and he did more or less abandon his family when his kids were adolescent. But he's very aware of his fallacies, and he simply wants to make up for it. He just wanted to spend time with his family again. His approach here may have been flawed, but his intentions were earnest. I think about the scene when he first discusses his quote-unquote illness with Margot, Richie, and Chaz. And while he's technically lying to them, there's almost this twinkle in his eye to be in that room with all three of them. And you really see that at the end of the scene when Richie, he popping up here once again in this conversation.
Oh, Richie.
When Richie gives
he's
him
the theme here.
this warm hug. But I love the response there from Royal. There's, of course, the sequences with Royal and Chaz's boys, Ari and Uzi, which are so endearing. But again, even though his interactions come from a pure place, and he just wanted to meet them and have some fun, he did ignore Chaz's directives by doing that. He has a few nice moments with Richie throughout the film, even outside of the hug. We sort of talked about that a little bit earlier. But the one that we haven't mentioned is the moment when he directly questions him about this tennis disaster that he had. Like, why he choked.
Yeah, that's great.
And that's where some of the humor comes in as well. And even though he's never treated Margot the same as the two boys, maybe there's a conversation to be had about his hierarchy as it relates to his kids.
Right.
He does try to connect with her, though, by buying her ice cream. And there's something about that gesture that almost seems childlike, in the sense that you take your kids to buy ice cream. You don't often maybe do that for other adults. And I think that's how Royal views it. Like, he's taking his little girl to buy ice cream. And so that becomes another compelling moment here. But maybe my favorite with Royal, aside from I've had a rough year, is this subtle remark he has when Richie is confronting Eli about his drug addiction.
I know where you're going with this.
That exchange, Eli says, "I just want it to be a Tenenbaum." And there's a quick cut to Royal who says, "Me too." And there's something about Hackman's delivery of that line that quintessentially defines Royal in the context of this film. It's so sincere.
Oh my God.
So poignant. He knows he's messed up. He may not know the extent of the damage he's caused, but he's aware that he failed his family, and now he just wants to be a part of their lives in some small way. So in that final act, he makes some sacrifices. He maintains optimism. He even gets a small job hoping someone notices, as he says. And again, it all comes from a place of earnest redemption, which is why I've Had a Rough Year, Dad is so impactful. And not only that, on this rewatch, I almost forgot this. The ambulance scene at the end. Oh my God.
And Ben Stiller's face. Ben Stiller's
absolutely destroyed me.
Actor insert shots here. Like, it's what really makes these moments work too. It's so
agree.
Good.
Yeah. Hackman gives an astounding performance, as we noted earlier. And I think part of what makes it so mesmerizing is how he taps into Royal self-awareness. It's something he doesn't shy away from. In fact, some of the dialogue is kind of brazen and crass. So I love how Royal is still this prickly character in some ways, but he's also so empathetic and warm because of that sincerity he brings to the motives of Royal. And I found it really visceral.
Oh, I mean, yeah, he's still very prickly, as you say. I mean, it's certainly a little frowned upon when he's teaching his grandkids how to shoplift, which are some of the that might be that whole montage might be the funniest sequence in the movie.
It's so good.
Yeah, it is. But again, cars. Oh my gosh! But again, there is thematic purpose in it all. It's something you brought up that I really did like as well is the fact that he tries to connect with Margot by buying her ice cream, and that's again a very relatable notion for any distant parent. At least I could assume that it is when you haven't seen your kids for what 10, 15 years, you haven't gotten to know them beyond what you remember them to be, children. So
Great
psychologically,
point.
all he knows how to do is relate to them as he used to see them as. He hasn't been there. It emphasizes his absence.
Yeah.
It makes in that regard. And I just have to comment on that exchange you brought up involving Eli Cash, where he says, I always wanted to be a Tenenbaum, which first off has a lot of thematic purpose as well, because we always had that one friend growing up that kind of wanted to be part of your family. And so
that is a theme here. It's a through line.
It is. Yeah. But how, I guess meta it is that character is played by Luke Wilson's real life brother. So an actual family member in real life trying into the family. I thought that was funny. But yes, Royal's reaction where he just, almost jovially says, me too. That's the moment I welled up. That was the hashtag JD Tears moment for me in this movie. It was just that exchange. It was right there when I knew, yep, this movie's great. This movie's wonderful. I knew that going in. That's a little facetious of me to say, but it's like that. If there was any one moment that was going to solidify it even further, that was it.
Yeah, I think that's what's so interesting about this rewatch, because I don't think I've seen this since 2013 when we first reviewed it.
Oh, wow.
And I've always had a strong reaction to I've had a rough year, which I'm sure we'll get to here in a little bit. But yeah, there were a few other moments here. I mentioned the moment of Richie on the rooftop. In fact, not only did the moment get to me emotionally when I was watching the film, but even when I was trying to write out some notes for this conversation, and I was trying to figure out how I wanted to articulate that, even when I was writing them out, I started to thinking about that exchange and how wonderfully tender it is. But that was another one as well. When he says me too, it absolutely got to me. Same thing with the ambulance moment at the end. I forgot that, spoiler alert for a film that's 20 years old at this point. But
hopefully you've seen it. Come on, people.
You almost forget that he does die at the end. And that moment in the ambulance, and again, Ben Stiller is so good. I love the reactionary shot from him, but it works. It's effective not just because of Stiller's performance there, but because of how the film treats Royal throughout, Gene Hackman's performance, and that sincerity. And I think you make a really great point too about how it's really not just Margot when he's buying her ice cream, that he's treating her like a child. It really is the boys as well, because even though I brought it up as somewhat of a joke where he says, or where he confronts Richie about that tennis match, and he says something along the lines of, I had a lot riding on that, Richie, financially and otherwise. And it is a funny moment, but he does confront it, and he's doing that like as a father would his son. Talking about their high school football team or something like that, because I know my father does that with me all the time about my high school basketball days. And that's how he's treating this moment, like Richie is a child once again. Or you think of the moment with Chaz where, he confronts Chaz about the BB in his arm or in his hand. He's like, you still got that in there? Like, he still thinks of these adults, but his kids as they're still kids because he was away for so long. I think you make a great point in all that.
And just the actual visualization of that baby still in Chaz's hand, like Wes actually giving it to us is again another. I know we're getting a little ahead of ourselves talking about some of the moments that just made us laugh the most. And the sight of that BB still in his hand, I'm actually showing you how it is here on our YouTube video for this, but it's I don't know why, it made me laugh. It really made me laugh there. And you mentioned Ben Stiller, and we talked about him a little bit during our episode 552 when we did our best performances of this year, and we both had Ben Stiller in our respective lists. I think I feel like of the kids, he's probably the one that has the most noticeable arc, at least if you're really looking at it at face value in a more immediate sense, because he's the one that has the biggest. I don't want to say hatred, because it's maybe too strong of a word, because it certainly doesn't end that way. But there is the biggest distance between father and child as it relates to Royal and Chaz.
And he's the most vocal.
He's the most vocal about it. So there is, again, that literal component that Ben Stiller has to navigate very well. That's where that anger comes through, something that Richie and Luke Wilson's performance has to be a bit more cryptic about, which is what I love about his performance, as we already talked about. But it makes the arc of Chaz all the more impactful by the end. Is it safe to assume that every actor in this movie is giving the best performance of their respective careers?
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because as I was contemplating this film after watching it last night, I kept having that thought, and I wasn't sure if I was being facetious or hyperbolic about it, recency biased, however you want to define it. I don't know, but I think there's a genuine argument to be made.
Yeah, it's in the conversation. That's the safest way we can say it without making any concrete statements. But
yes.
But even Ben Stiller, he's another one where I'm almost tempted to say that. And again, that arc is certainly the most noticeable, but those tender qualities at the end of the movie are, I hate to use the word tear-jerking in a Wes Anderson movie, but they damn are. They really do get to me. And I think it's because both of these characters, Royal and Chaz specifically, in a way, you kind of notice that they have similar, almost parallel arcs with each other, which is why that moment at the end between them is so powerful, because it's them almost meeting at the same page, at the same level, at the right time too. A child finally opening up that I've had a rough year, and more or less the dad saying, yeah, welcome to fatherhood. I've had a rough life. So now we can finally relate to each other. So the fact that they're both navigating similar troubling waters to get to that point, that the meetup of that point is just so cathartic. It's perfectly told from a storytelling standpoint on Wes Anderson's part.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Ben Stiller, as I noted, one of my nominees for Best Supporting Actor. He is really great in this film. The way he taps into anger and indignancy toward his father, it really is palpable throughout the film. Later scenes do bring context as to the conflict between them, but we do get a sense of it early when we learn of the BB in his hand, as we noted earlier, how it got there, and how, in a way, he saw that as an act of betrayal. Because when Royal shoots him, what is Chaz's response to that?
You're on my team.
The same team.
Yeah.
And I think Stiller does a great job of demonstrating why he feels apathetic toward his father, which adds further heft to how Chaz treats his own boys. Yes, part of it is because of the death of his wife, and so he's become overly protective. But I think it's fair to say that part of that equation is that he doesn't want to be like Royal. And he wants to be this loving and caring dad. One little detail I love about that in this film, and this is another one of those new emotional nuances that I missed the first time around, the first couple of times I saw this film. But one little detail I love about Chaz in this film is the moment where he says goodnight to his boys after they first got to the Tenenbaum house, after this little fire drill that they had, which is a funny little moment in this film.
Oh, yeah.
But they get to the Tenenbaum house. He goes to say goodnight. And as he's about to leave, he turns around and lays out his sleeping bag to sleep with them in the room. And we see one of the boys get down from his bunk to lay down with Chaz. And it broke me. It is so good and wonderfully evokes the heart that is at the core of this film, particularly with Chaz as it relates to fathers and sons and that duality he has here. But that kind of detail is important because what it takes for Chaz to finally see Royal's newfound sincerity is when he finds out that it was Royal that saved his boys from the crash. coupled with this amazing gesture from Royal when he buys the dog from the firefighters, a completely unselfish and loving thing to do.
Yeah.
Definitely gives weight to Royal's choices and the idea that he wants to be a part of this family. And for Chaz, both of those things coalesce that offer up this new profound truth for him. And it allowed him to get vulnerable. And that's where I've had a rough year, Dad comes out. And the way Stiller says that line, the way he breaks, like the way his voice breaks there, it is again,
so therapeutic.
I'm trying not to be hyperbolic, but I'm not sure Stiller's had a better moment of acting than that one in his entire career. If
this is an all-time moment.
Absolutely. The totality of his performances, maybe there's one you could argue that has more than this
look that up
but
as we're talking. Is there a performance of his that I think is overall better than this one? But I will at least agree. I'll at least agree with you. There's no moment that's better than this.
That's his best moment. Absolutely. And it is incredible. It's so good. And Anderson earns that moment with his storytelling. Stiller's performance is phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And so much of the emotionality of the moment is because of Stiller. But Anderson deserves credit too, because his storytelling, the writing of those two characters, Royal and Chaz separately, but also together, and how we arrive at that moment, there's so much agency to his storytelling that gives credence to it all on its own terms, even separate from Stiller's performance.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the selfless gesture of Royal buying a dog for Chaz and his two kids after the unfortunate incident at the end involving Eli and him running the car into the house and everything that happened there. What was their dog's name originally? Buckley or something like that?
I'm not sure.
Correct me if I'm wrong out there, listeners. I'm totally blanking on the dog's name, but it's not even just the fact that he provided that gesture. It's the fact that he bought a Dalmatian. And Chaz was known for cloning mice as Dalmatians as a kid. That was one of his quirky qualities. So in a weird, indirect way, it almost
those little details, man.
But it's like Chaz realizing it's almost like his reaction was not the selfless act itself of buying a replacement dog for his children and his family. It's the fact that secretly his father was always listening to his son and remembered something from that childhood. So it's almost like this indirect opening of sorts. So I little things like that are so calculated and so methodical from Wes Anderson's point that really make this movie work. And, to get back to the whole Ben Stiller of it all, I'm looking up his filmography on IMDb, and I don't know, maybe the Meyerowitz stories, maybe Greenberg.
He's very good there.
Yeah, but I don't know.
I might take this performance, though, over those.
Yeah, and of course, it's a very different kind of performance, but I do love him in Dodgeball.
He is very good at that film,
but I mean, you can't really compare that performance with really anything else he's doing in a more serious way. So, I'll say this is his best performance. I think it's safe to say that.
Yeah, I think so as well. And that's the thing. You think of Ben Stiller, and there are way more dodgeballs in his filmography than Tenenbaums. And I don't want to slight those performances, because comedic performances are great and often very challenging in their own right. However, I do think this one has the most nuance to it. Even in a supporting role like this, I think there's a lot to Stiller's performance where, again, the way he has to tap into that indignancy and anger, and how it's unleashed not just at Royal, but really everyone around him, including his own kids at times. And of course, it's rooted in this undealt with grief, but also the dysfunction of his family as well. It's all a part of it. And that becomes ripped away in these really interesting ways at the end of the film that offers some of the film's strongest, cathartic moments. And he delivers in a big way.
He does. I agree.
let's talk about Margot. I want to talk a
Margot,
little bit about Margot. If
Gwyneth
that's okay with
Paltrow.
everybody.
Again, another great performance. Best
Another
performance
great
of her career.
performance. Yeah, I again think there's an argument to be made, at least in the conversation.
So
And
dry. Like in a way, she almost gives the funniest performance in the movie. She might not have the funniest moments, but there's there's almost like an expressionless nature to Margot that, again, it's kind of similar to Richie, to what I was talking about earlier, that the lack of expression actually makes it even more expressive, if that's even possible, because it showcases this like deep rooted unspoken anger and sorrow that they're just not willing to therapeutically let out just yet. And I think Margot as a character is another embodiment of that, and Paltrow does a great job holding that in as if that character is just ready to explode at any moment. And I love that.
I do love the passive agency she has in this film. Her personality isn't to be openly indignant like Chaz,
Right.
as you're talking about, but unlike Richie, she is defiant. She always
True.
has some sort of retort to Royal's ignorance when he intentionally or unintentionally belittles her. There's the scene we mentioned earlier of Royal trying to connect with her by buying ice cream. And there comes a moment within that sequence where she says, "I bet you don't even know my middle name," which is hilarious when we find out what it is, because it's a name that is very personal to Royal. So she may be quiet and passive, but she's also snappy and witty, which is maybe to be expected given her previous success as a writer. Similarly to Royal, she challenges Raleigh as well, in the sense that, for one, she isn't faithful to him, as we talked about earlier. We come to find out that she's sleeping with Eli, but she's also in love with Richie. So she has no loyalty to Raleigh, and she demonstrates that a few times by moving out of their home. And when Raleigh questions if she's coming back, she flat out says no. And that kind of passive agency, I think, is important, because you think about the stakes of this film as it relates to Richie. How she responds to him at the end could have dictated how Richie re-engaged with the world, if he even did at all. But she does respond to him, which brings him some closure. However, it comes with the caveat that, I believe you noted this at the beginning of the conversation, it is going to be a secret affair, something that she initiates, which is to say, while there is a melancholy to her character, I love how different it is from Chaz and Richie, but at the same time, it's rooted from the same place as her brothers, and how Anderson weaves that all together, I think, is, again, impeccable.
And that response that she has about her and Richie being secretly in love, it comes at a point where it seems as though these familial connections are starting to strengthen a little bit. So it's in a way, it's almost like these two characters beginning to recognize that that there is a taboo nature to this romance. And maybe there is something to be careful about here. Because like I said, like the fact that there is this romantic interest between these two, it very ironically showcases the distance between them, the ignorance between them, which is very interesting. So that tent scene and then that rebuttal that Margot has is almost like this sign of hope that eventually they'll begin to see each other as family as opposed to love interests, which is where I think Wes Anderson does a really great job dancing around the taboo nature and the controversy of their relationship. And once again, it makes it seem so purposeful. This movie weirdly doesn't work without that quote unquote gross romance. It really, you kind of need it here. But yeah, I do think Gwyneth Paltrow does a great job managing those waters. And like you said, delivering this sort of dry, passive, but already biting and snarky kind of performance in a way. The fact that she is so expressionless at times actually makes it all the more biting and conniving, right? And that's where I think she's so good at emulating those things.
I agree. I do love her performance, because in some ways it's a little bit of a dual performance, because the dialogue that she does have here, I do think is quite great because as we've been talking about, she does have a little bit of an agency. It's passive, but she's willing to retort when she needs to, or at the very least, she's unafraid to speak her mind, even if it's passive. As I noted with Raleigh, when he asked if she's coming home, she didn't have to think about it. She wasn't angry or mean, but she says, no, I don't think that I am. So there is this confidence, like her identity doesn't seem to be as frail as perhaps Chaz and Richie are. However, there is still a sorrow, complicated nuance to her character that she is very much wrestling with for sure, particularly as it relates to the men in her life, not just her father or her brothers, but everyone else we meet as well.
Oh yeah, the Jamaican artist as well.
all of that. She is as lost and broken as any other character here.
Yeah.
And at times it does come through in the dialogue and how unafraid she is to speak her mind, but equally it is her facial tics. It is the wordless the wordless expression she conveys that are often
or just simply
memorable.
The tapping of her wooden finger.
Yeah, exactly. Like
I mean, it's almost as if her performance is done in Morse code using that finger at times.
Absolutely. Like her whole character could have been functioning within a silent film and you knew everything you needed to about the character.
That's fair.
Like,
that's a great point.
Like every like the dialogue and the verbal exchanges she has are great. But yes, it does function wonderfully as this silent film character, and Gwyneth Paltrow, I think, delivers that just so wonderfully. And I think that's what I love about the not just her performance, but Anderson's approach to this film and his economy to tethering hilarity and melancholy. And I think that maybe quintessentially comes through the best and that character and Margot.
And the way that she bounces off that dryness with every other character weirdly like emphasizes the strengths of those other performances, which is what makes for a great ensemble piece, right? It's the way that these performances are able to literally complement each other. Like all these performances work on their own terms, but like Richie isn't as compelling of a character without Margot to back him up, or with Chaz and Royal, that relationship, that dynamic as well. Or just the melancholy of Raleigh you were talking about, played by Bill Murray. There's a sadness there too, and you've got Gwyneth Paltrow doing so much heavy lifting for other characters, and it's not just her. Other performances here are doing the same thing for other characters. That it's almost like the backbone of sorts for so much of what's going on here. And I do think she's really great at it. And again, kicking myself. I don't think I nominated her for Best Supporting Actress. I probably should eat those words up, I guess. But it's a great performance.
Yeah, and I think a lot of why this film works so great, and we've somewhat touched on this already, but the way the comedy and sorrow share the same space in this film is so singular to Anderson's filmography. There is a funny and almost absurd dynamic at play with the Tenenbaums' familiar dysfunction for sure.
Oh yeah,
but
I mean the whole opening sequence with "Hey Jude" playing in the background is
absolutely.
I mean it's very, very tongue in cheek, but at the same time still has a very serious undertone about what it means to raise a family of geniuses and how that creates a distance between you and your kids. So it's perfect balancing there from Wes Anderson.
Absolutely, the music, the dialogue, the writing, the character work here. While there is a lot of levity, as we've been talking about, every frame of this film also comes with some sort of sorrow, and those tones coalesce into something that I think is mesmerizing. Anderson's tone management in this film, I know, has already been studied and should continue to be studied for decades because it is a miracle how he pulls this off. There are elevated stakes here because of how these characters are written and the choices they make as a result of that melancholy, but it's never cloying or sentimental. And somehow, in the middle of all of that deep sorrow, he finds notes of levity that are at times even laugh out loud funny. I think of the moment when they go to the graveyard for the first time, and after seeing Royal's mother's grave, he sees Chaz walk away and says something like, "Oh yeah, we have another body buried here." Like, it's so good. It's really funny. Maybe one that is less obvious, and this circles back to what you were just saying about the dynamic between Richie and Margot. But the moment after Richie gets out of the hospital, what we see is him immediately hopping the fence and climbing through the window to Margot's room, which I find subtly quite funny because it suggests he's done this a million times before.
Oh, that's a great point. He did that so effortlessly.
So effortlessly. And when you consider the complicated taboo qualities of that relationship and how that continues to unfold here, I thought that was a fun little detail. Or the moment where Chaz realizes there's blood on his son's face and Royal just passively mentions, "Oh, don't worry about that. That's just dog's blood." I'm like, what do you mean? Like, it's just so funny how the film is able to.
But he doesn't call attention to those moments. He being Wes Anderson himself, you kind of blink and miss him, which I think is what makes the film so fascinating.
Exactly.
I do think this is Wes Anderson's best directed film. I mean, I guess the case could be made for any of his two stop motion animated films, whether it be Fantastic Mr. Fox or Isle of Dogs, or maybe you can throw the Grand Budapest Hotel into that conversation as well.
Would probably be the other one.
But I think those are more, again, this is, I'm using this phrase with a but that's not to knock the work that he's doing on those other films. Those are more technical achievements, right? And I think there's an argument to be made that it's way more difficult to navigate this type of tone management than it is the technical merits of those other films. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a director. I can't say for sure, but I would assume or guess that what we're doing here with Royal Tenenbaums was more difficult to navigate and to fully balance those tonal extremes out in the way that he does, which I do think it might be his best effort.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's the tone management of this alone, I think, is a mountainous challenge when you consider that this is a film that features a suicide attempt. For one, there's a lot of dysfunction to this family, and you do feel like he does want us to feel that sorrow. It is lingering over every frame of this film, and you do feel it. And as we've been talking about, there are several potent emotional beats that come about that you just typically don't get out of a Wes Anderson film. In your words, it's almost Spielbergian in that regard. But again, that emotion isn't cloying or overly sentimental. He does make it work. However, it's also Wes Anderson, so it does come with these quirky sensibilities, and there's fun to be had. There are laugh out loud moments here, but it's all interwoven naturally. And if you're not looking for that humor, you might miss it, because I think it is naturally
it's subtle. It's very cryptic, I think is the best way to put it. It's not reliant on it as much as maybe later Wes Anderson films would be. It's not like, let's say, Moonrise Kingdom, where it's sometimes all about the quirky and the absurdist nature of it in some ways.
Yes.
Like here, I think the best way I can describe it is that it's more controlled here with the Royal Tenenbaums, which is what I love about that. I love that balance.
Controlled, but never manufactured. And I think that is important, because with his dollhouse aesthetic and whimsy, that can sometimes feel like an artifice. It never really does for me, because I love Wes Anderson and I love his aesthetic and visual ambition, but I can understand why some would feel that way. And I don't think that is the case here at all. I think he's
agree.
able to bring us that whimsy and that artistry, but it's injected into a film that has this deep, somber melancholy to it. It is
Mm-hmm.
funny. And that's one thing. And then there's all these performances we've talked about. And not only is it a great ensemble cast, we've talked incessantly in this conversation about how these specific performances might be, arguably, are the best of their respective careers. That is an incredible feat all on its own. And then there's the cinematography of this film, which is as exquisite and as redolent as anything that he's ever done. And it's insane because this is a film that primarily takes place, not exclusively, but primarily takes place at the Tenenbaums' house. Like so much of this film takes place in one location.
It's mostly indoors, but I don't know. Weirdly, it's Robert Yeoman. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. He is Wes Anderson's usual cinematographer, so he has done pretty much all of his films. So it has the same color palette, the same sense of space that all of those films do. But yeah, you're right. Somehow it feels so cinematic, and you know what it is? This house feels so claustrophobic as well, as if to almost emphasize the not just the tight corridors of the house, but just the fragmented minds of these characters and their relationships with each other.
Yeah,
it's all working together in a beautiful, seamless way.
I completely agree. So for as much as I love the writing and the emotion of this film, the performances, visually it is just dazzling. You can spend hours simply looking for screenshots of this film and admiring the visual beauty of it. The music, I noted that it might be the best soundtrack that we've seen in an Anderson film. And some of that is pre-existing music. Some of it is the score by Mark Mothersbaugh.
Yeah.
It is incredible. The music to this film, on its own terms, the music is great, but how it's interwoven into this film, the timing of it, the editing of it is incredibly incisive. Like,
I agree.
It's so good. Everything about this film, even the voiceover narration, which I know you're typically not a huge fan of, but I love how that is employed.
Well, it depends
here.
on how it's used. Here, I mean, it's only used to help, I guess, emphasize the storybook qualities of this narrative and how it's inspired by the works of J.D. Salinger, like I mentioned, for instance. So it works here for me. Usually, where voiceover doesn't work is when it's there to literalize the complexities and nuances of a movie. And here it's not doing that. Here it's more for tone. It's more for an aesthetic reason, which is what I love about it.
I agree. And I think that's why I will absolutely go to bat for the opening titles of this film, or those opening sequences, because they are whimsy. It's conventional Wes Anderson storytelling and quirkiness that you either love or you don't. I do love the whimsy of it. I think the voiceover narration is fantastic. And again, the music there, almost iconic at this point, at least if you're a Wes Anderson fan. Like it's so great. The other thing though too is I do think it starts to establish the film's melancholy. We do see the beginnings of this family dysfunction and how it's laying the seeds for what we're about to see, which I do think is often lost in the conversation, because that is one criticism I see somewhat often lofted at this film, is those opening title sequences, how tonally it might feel like a juxtaposition to, again, a film that eventually features a suicide. But I will argue that it isn't just whimsy. I don't think it's artifice. I'm with you. I think Anderson is aware of where this film is going to go, and he does plant those melancholic seeds. I think they're there. I think you do feel them in a small way that obviously blossom into something much more later on. So it's not just whimsy and fun music. in
Well,
narration.
even so, I think the argument could be made that even if he didn't maintain a sense of melancholy throughout the entire film and the whimsical nature of those opening credits, I feel like you can still argue that the point is to set us up for something that we're not expecting. So,
Yeah,
like, there is a
fair.
sleight of hand to that. In a weird way, it almost sort of reminded me of a film from 2 years ago. 2 years ago being, the year 1999, 2 years before
2 years
this
for
movie came out. Yeah,
yes.
2 years before 2001. But in
Yeah.
1999 was another Anderson film, Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, which had a
Yes.
very, like, a very sinister tongue-in-cheek sort of introduction, but there's a deep-rooted sadness in that movie. So
Yeah.
it's almost like it's
Great
there to
comparison.
literally
Yeah.
pull the rug from under your feet. And I feel like Wes is kind of doing that here, but I don't disagree. I think that there is still a consistency with what he's doing in those opening titles
Mhm.
and how he maintains that throughout the entire film. Again, tone management. I do think it is very consistent throughout the
It's
entirety
so
of it.
good. Absolutely
Yeah.
remarkable. I could spend hours talking about Anderson's direction in this film. It is incredible. It truly
Is Royal
a
Tenenbaum
masterwork.
himself one of the greatest movie characters of all time?
Yes.
I think that's a great way to conclude this.
I agree. Well, and the other thing about that, I think what's interesting, the one element of Hackman's performance that we haven't really got to yet, and I
Mhm.
think this is significant to why the performance is so goddamn brilliant. Near the end of the film, he apologizes to Henry for being an asshole,
Yeah.
to which
Yeah.
Henry says, "You're not an asshole, you're just a son of a bitch."
Yeah.
And that's the thing.
Yeah.
He is. It's
Yeah.
not as if Royal is brazenly antagonizing or being malicious with his actions. He might be selfish. He
Yeah.
may be lying, but his motive is to be with his family. He just wants to be around his wife and kids again. And it's
Mhm.
sincere, as we talked about earlier. But as we see within the context of the events that play out here, and of course, with some of the backstory we see early on,
Yeah.
he's a little bit prickly. He's
Oh, yeah.
just a little bit of a son of a bitch. And Hackman plays that to perfection because there's a version of this where he or another actor, if they were in this role, takes that too far.
Yeah.
Where Royal is wholly unsympathetic and a pure asshole and someone
I
that we don't
Yeah.
like or that we're not able to get on that wavelength. But Hackman restrains himself. He's prickly, but he's funny, he's charming, he's affable, and most importantly, sincere, which is why I keep going back to that word. It is so
Yep.
important because
Yeah.
it tunes us into his emotional heartbeat, the fact that he just wants to be with his kids and we
Mhm.
believe him, but in the middle of that he may do or say some things that make him a son of a bitch, and
Yeah.
that's writing a fine line there.
There's a very big difference between the two. I love the sleight of hand there. And
Mhm.
yeah, it's one of those performances, Gene Hackman specifically, where it really sneaks up on you regarding how great that it is. Because you watch this movie for the first time and you go into it with that preconceived notion that it's a great performance. You might come out of it thinking, yeah, it was good, but I didn't love it as much as you did. And then the response would be, just sit with it for a little bit. Just think about it. Watch it
Yeah.
again in a couple years, and then you'll start to see the light. But
Yeah, just
that's kind of the sign
exactly.
of a great performance, right? Is when there's
Mhm.
the secretness of it all, if that's
Mhm.
even a word. It's
Yeah,
just
I
like
agree.
the fact you have to dig for it to really find those layers.
I agree. One other note before we get to the end here.
Mhm.
Speaking of Henry, and we brought up Raleigh earlier, and I think we can bring Eli into this conversation as well. There is this through line that, with characters here that are on the outside of the
Mhm.
Tenenbaum family that are working their way to be in the Tenenbaum family.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Anderson is making some sort of commentary here on our fascination with celebrity or
Mhm.
eccentricity, perhaps both of those things all in one. I don't know.
Maybe.
Or the idea of flawed celebrities, because the Tenenbaum family had their successes, but they all flamed out in some sort of way. But even with that, they're still in a lure to be a part of this family. And again, that's not the main crux of what's happening here, but it is interesting that we have these characters on the outside that want to be on the inside for whatever reason. And it, I think it is some of the maybe not celebrity, but something about the eccentricity of this family and the successes that make people want to be around them despite the dysfunction.
Well, it's like when you're in school and you find a group of kids, maybe they're siblings, that tend to be sort of part of the it crowd. And like they're just really good at stuff. They're popular, whatever it is. And that's not to say that that's the case for the Tenenbaum children, because they had their own dysfunctionality to contend with. But, children, especially growing up, sort of have that instinct, right? That's what makes Eli Cash as a character so interesting. You kind of want to climb your way to that same status because it's like, oh, they're the cool kids. I want to get to know them. I want to be part of that. I want to be in that crowd, in that club. And it's just interesting to see it from the perspective of older characters, Bill Murray and Danny Glover specifically, who are kind of marrying into that. So in a way, it's almost like they're only part of it by default. And ironically, they don't feel like they are part of it. So there's like this distance there in a very interesting way that, a lot of layers to this movie, man. A lot of layers to really dig for.
Absolutely. I mean, it really is fascinating what Anderson is doing. And as it relates to that specific idea, I think that's what makes Eli to me so compelling. And, at times the character is a little bit grating, but that is what it is
supposed to
for.
be. Yeah.
And ultimately, I think he fits impeccably within the larger scheme of this film and what Anderson is doing, because as we noted earlier, as he confides with Richie, he wants to be a part of this family. As we see, he's just as broken as anyone in the Tenenbaums. And at one point we find out that he clips out news articles about him and sends them to Etheline, the mother of the Tenenbaums. And it's compelling how he's desperate for that. And then ultimately, symbolically, he tries to crash the party.
Yeah.
And force his way in.
It makes me wonder what Eli Cash's backstory was, what his relationship with his own parents were. And I think that's the charm of Wes Anderson's writing and storytelling in general, is that he makes us ponder on those things. We don't always have the answers for some of those supporting characters like an Eli Cash, but I do think Wes is trying to get us to hypothesize about who these people are that the film isn't showing us, right? So maybe Eli had a very frayed relationship with his parents, and he felt that the Tenenbaum family was a better fit for his needs. I don't know. There could be something there like that, a sense of jealousy. I don't know what it is, but the fact that it could be, but the fact that we're being invited into that conversation, I think, is really interesting.
I agree. I agree. And it's really interesting. And I think Owen Wilson has a few comedic beats here that are really good. As a performer, I think he's quite wonderful.
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of Etheline, I do want to speak to her real quickly here, because she is the one that is the most grounded and unchanging. And again, it's a character that is perhaps the most scrutinized when people are criticizing this film. However, I will say this. I think if you remove her from the equation, this whole family falls apart and falls quite fast. So I think she's actually kind of vital to the larger scheme that this film employs. I think she needs to be the one that is grounded. She needs to be the one that is unchanging. So we might not learn as much about her as everyone else, but I think that is kind of the point. And I honestly don't know if we need to know more beyond that,
No,
other
because
than
the
what you mentioned
stoicism of that
earlier.
character is kind of the security blanket of sorts,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we do learn that she's the one that brought up these children because
Mhm.
Royal wasn't around. She does have a brief moment where she questions if she did the right thing or if she did a good job because look at how broken these kids are. But when you're a single mother, essentially, of three, and not only that, but three kids that are supposed geniuses that are super successful when they're extremely
Yeah.
young.
Well, it's like how do you contend with the feeling of abandonment that mother is also going through? You try to
Yes,
overcorrect, right? It's like, okay, now I have to be here for these children in an extra special way. So these children are great at things. I'm going to force even more greatness on them. So the film also does a great job showcasing ethylene as this security blanket, like we're talking about, this foundational support for the family. But there is still an argument that maybe she pushed them a little bit too hard into
that's possible.
that push
Yeah.
for greatness as well. So there is, there's a dichotomy there. There's a straddling of two different extremes that are both right and wrong, which is again very, very, very purposeful and very interesting.
This movie is so good. It's a masterpiece.
Plot twist,
It-
plot twist. This movie's bad. This movie's not good. We hate it. We hate it.
Do you have any final thoughts here on the Royal Tenenbaums?
What city does this take place in? Yeah, that's one thing I never really knew.
Good question.
I think it's New York. Even the
Okay.
when of it is well, that's something I like about the movie is that there's never really a clear sense of place, right? It's never really defined. So of course it allows us to focus our attention on the family and what matters. But yeah, I always wondered where this took place because at times, yeah, it reminds me of New York City. At times, it kind of reminds me of Chicago. Then at times, it kind of reminds me of London. it's almost
Yeah.
like this smorgasbord of urban life all rolled into one. And I also can't really decipher the time period as if like, I think the whole point is that it's trying to showcase how that doesn't really matter, right?
Yeah, it's
That there
timeless.
is, yeah, that's it. There's a universality to these issues that they just that never end. That they'll always find themselves carried with time. So anyway, I just thought that was a really neat touch that you can't really decipher that, and if it is meant to be clear, I completely missed it. But I kind of like that it's not clear. I think that adds to the timeless nature of what we're talking about here and those tender qualities.
Yeah, no, I completely echo all of that. One moment that I wanted to bring up here in my final thoughts, circling back to Royal quickly, and this also tethers to our conversation about tone management in this film because there is a moment where everyone gathers in Royal's room. And at this point in the film, they think that their father is dying, has weeks to live. But Royal is confronted. He is caught in the lie and is exposed thanks to Henry, who did some digging and found out the truth.
Yeah.
And I love Royal's reaction to it where he just accepts it. He's like, well, walks into the closet, gets dressed out of this hospital gown and into a suit.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, that's what it is. And they're like, how did you get all this hospital gear? And so, like, it's a funny little exchange, despite the gravity of the moment that they realize they've been lied to for days about what had happened. So, of course, they're feeling anger and upset about their father lying to them, but it's also very funny. And then comes another wonderful emotional beat that is subtle and really effective, where Royal simply says, "The last 6 days have been the best 6 days of my life."
I love
And
that. Yeah.
that to me, it's so good. And again, it speaks to that sincerity that he just wanted to get back with his family again. Maybe he had to manufacture it. He had to lie and able to get everyone there or to get himself back into the house. But it brought this joy that he just had not experienced in years, in decades.
Yeah.
Or even if you take him at his word, his entire life, he had never experienced that kind of joy, which says something about aging and our mortality. Thinking of you, Martin Scorsese, in this moment, who had an incredible interview the day we are recording this, talking about those very things.
He did, yeah.
And so, like,
we should
to what you were saying earlier, like those kind of details and what Anderson invokes here, it makes you think about those things. So even though the film itself doesn't directly tackle that specific conversation, that is what's happening here. And the film does allow for us to wrestle with why Royal is doing these things. And a line like, these are the best 6 days I've had in my entire life, it brings out that entire conversation. And it comes through because of Hackman's performance and that tender quality he brings to Royal. Despite the prickly nature of him at times, you believe him. It is true.
You're right.
That is how he feels. Even if his kids in the moment don't understand it, they certainly are feeling righteously anger for being lied to. But you think about that in context of how this film ultimately crystallizes with Chaz realizing the truth about that sincerity. You know, when he finds out that Roy bought this dog and saved his kids' life, or the moment with Richie on the rooftop, and perhaps even some closure with Margot at the end. And of course, he signs the divorce papers for Etheline and Henry. So like there is this drastic change to him that comes about because of being exposed. And I think maybe there's something to be said about that as well that we haven't even talked about here.
Is that your way of saying we're not done talking about this movie yet?
No, I mean, I could go on for another half hour, but
at this timestamp, I think it's fair to say we shouldn't talk about it that much on episode 553 when we actually have it in our top fives, right?
Yeah, when it's brought up, we'll just kind of point back to this review episode. But yeah, it's really great. I love this film. The performances are elite. I will echo the score and the music again. I think is incredible. Absolutely. The aesthetics of this film, the coloration of it. Again, just from a sensory perspective, there's so much to admire. This is Anderson at his very best. As you noted, this is maybe his best. I would argue it is his best directed movie. So just from a craft perspective, this film is incredibly exquisite. And then you invoke all of those somber qualities, the melancholy we've been talking about, and just the deep sadness of this film that he just hasn't done since. You know, it's partially why I loved Asteroid City, because Asteroid City is the closest he's gotten back to this.
Yeah, so it was almost nostalgic in some ways.
It was a little nostalgic in that regard. But yeah, I love it. Whatever he and Owen Wilson were cooking at this time, it was phenomenal stuff. It was absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
And this is an all-time film for me. Absolutely all-time film for me. And that might be something we say a couple of times when we get to our top 10
Is that
list,
going to be a
because,
theme with our top 10s for this year?
2001 is a surprisingly phenomenal year for movies.
You know, it and I was trying to look at this. We'll talk more about this on episode 553, but whether it has more heavy hitters than other years is almost beside the point. It's the heaviness of those heavy hitters that we're going to be talking about, because we're talking about films that are now crossing over into our respective favorite movies of all time, right?
Yes.
I feel like every one of these retrospectives in every specific year we've done, there's always been at least a few films that fall into that category, right? It's like, oh, this is one of my all-time favorite films. I think we're going to say that about like at least 7 or 8 movies.
It's possible
on
it's
this specific
possible.
Retrospective. Yeah,
absolutely. Anyway, I think that'll do it. We've covered the gamut here on the Royal Tenenbaums, one of my all-time favorites. Brendan, anything else? I think that'll do it. I guess.
I think so.
feel free to hit us up on social media, Facebook,
Yeah.
Twitter, Instagram. Let us know if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. If you want to hit us up in long form. If you're watching us on YouTube, leave a comment below. Let us know what you think of the Royal Tenenbaums. And I think that's it.
I think that's it. Is this
Am I
our longest
missing
review
anything?
ever?
It might be when it's all said and done.
I don't know. I think the Tree
We've
of
had
Life
some
was
long
longer.
ones, though.
I think the Tree of Life was longer.
It might be. I'd have to look it up, but
Yeah.
were we the only ones on that, though? Were
We
there
were.
other ones?
No,
Were
you
there-
and I were the only ones.
We were the
yeah.
only ones? Okay.
Yeah.
Then, yeah. But this is,
Well,
up
this
there
is
for
kind of
me in
deserved.
terms
I
of-
mean, I feel like this new format has allowed us to be a little bit more brief with some of our thoughts. We could practice a bit more levity, but there are times we have to go back to our old habits and just talk and get everything out on the table. I think this is one of those movies that was certainly a warranted conversation.
I agree. And I loved it. Loved every part of this. With all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Stay tuned for the main show this weekend. We will get to that 2001 retrospective, talk about our top 10 movies of that year.
Yep.
So be on the lookout for that. We will see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. I've had a rough year, Dad. Oh, so good. So good.